Sarah Mitchell stood in her small apartment kitchen, steam rising from her morning coffee as she stared out the window at the quiet suburban street. At 38, she looked like any other working mother preparing for another ordinary day. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard uniform of her civilian job at the local library. Nothing about her appearance suggested that 12 years ago, she had been one of the most skilled fighter pilots in the United States Air Force. The alarm clock buzzed from the bedroom, followed by the familiar sound of her 10-year-old daughter Emma shuffling around, getting ready for school. Sarah smiled softly, remembering how different her mornings used to be. Back then, she would wake up at dawn on military bases, suit up in flight gear, and prepare to take control of some of the most advanced aircraft ever built. Now her biggest challenge was making sure Emma had her homework packed and her lunch money ready. "Mom, I can't find my science project," Emma called from upstairs, her voice carrying that slight panic that only children could manage over seemingly small things. "Check under your bed, sweetie," Sarah replied, taking another sip of her coffee. She had learned that most of Emma's lost items usually ended up in the strangest places. Being a single mother meant developing a kind of detective skill that rivaled any training she had received in the military. As Emma thundered down the stairs with her project in hand, Sarah couldn't help but notice how much her daughter resembled her ex-husband Mark. The same bright blue eyes and stubborn chin that had once charmed Sarah during their brief marriage, before the demands of military life and personal differences had torn them apart. Mark lived across the country now, working as a commercial airline pilot, sending support checks and holiday cards but rarely visiting. The divorce had been the beginning of Sarah's exit from the Air Force. She had been climbing the ranks steadily, earning respect from fellow pilots and commanding officers alike. Her call sign had been Phoenix because of her ability to recover from seemingly impossible situations during training exercises and missions. She could handle an F-16 like it was an extension of her own body, and there had been serious discussions about her joining the elite F-22 Raptor program. But everything changed when Emma was born. The long deployments, the dangerous missions, and the constant uncertainty had become too much to bear as a new mother. Mark had wanted her to choose between her family and her career, and ultimately, the choice had been clear. She had submitted her resignation, packed up her life, and moved to this small town in Colorado where she could raise Emma in peace. The library job had been a godsend. It was quiet, stable, and allowed her to be home every evening when Emma returned from school. The head librarian, Mrs. Patterson, was a kind woman in her 60s who had never asked too many questions about Sarah's past. Most people in town knew she had served in the military, but they assumed she had been in some administrative role. Sarah preferred it that way. After dropping Emma off at school, Sarah drove through the familiar streets to the library. The building was a charming old structure with tall windows and wooden shelves that creaked when people walked between them. She unlocked the front door and began her routine of turning on lights, checking returned books, and preparing for another quiet day among the stacks. Around mid-morning, as Sarah was helping an elderly man find books about gardening, she noticed a young Air Force officer in dress blues standing near the front desk. Her heart skipped slightly, the way it always did when anything reminded her of her former life. The officer was speaking quietly with Mrs. Patterson, who kept glancing in Sarah's direction with a concerned expression. Sarah finished helping the gardener and walked slowly toward the front desk, her palms beginning to sweat for reasons she couldn't quite explain. The officer was a captain, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of precise posture that marked career military personnel. When he saw her approaching, he straightened even more, if that was possible. "Ms. Mitchell?" he asked, his voice carrying the formal tone she remembered so well from her own service days. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Patterson excused herself, sensing that this conversation required privacy. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Rodriguez from Peterson Air Force Base. I need to speak with you about a matter of some urgency." He paused, studying her face carefully. "I understand you formerly held the rank of major and served as a fighter pilot with distinction." Sarah felt the familiar weight of her past settling on her shoulders like an old flight jacket. She had worked so hard to build a simple, quiet life away from all of that complexity and danger. Emma was finally settled in school, had friends, was happy. They had found peace in this small town where the biggest excitement was usually the annual harvest festival. "Captain, my service ended 12 years ago," Sarah said carefully. "I'm not sure what this is about, but I'm no longer involved with military operations of any kind." Captain Rodriguez nodded respectfully but didn't back down. "Ma'am, I understand your position and I want to assure you that we wouldn't be here if the situation weren't extremely serious. There's been an incident involving an F-22 Raptor, and frankly, we need someone with your specific expertise and experience." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. F-22 Raptor. The aircraft she had dreamed of flying. The program she had been invited to join before she chose motherhood instead. She had followed the development of the program from civilian life, reading articles and watching news reports with a mixture of pride and regret. "I think there's been some mistake," Sarah began, but Captain Rodriguez was already shaking his head. "No mistake, ma'am. Your former commanding officer, General Harrison, specifically recommended you for this situation. He said if anyone could help us solve this problem, it would be Phoenix." Hearing her old call sign spoken aloud after all these years sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. General Harrison had been like a father figure to her during her service, and she had respected him more than any other officer she had known. If he was asking for her help, the situation must be truly desperate. Sarah glanced around the quiet library, thinking about Emma and their peaceful life, wondering how everything could change so quickly with just a few words from a stranger in uniform. Captain Rodriguez led Sarah to a quiet corner of the library, where they could speak without being overheard. He opened a thin briefcase and pulled out several documents, each marked with official seals and classification stamps that Sarah recognized from her military days. The sight of those familiar red letters spelling out "classified" brought back a flood of memories she had worked hard to suppress. 3 days ago, Captain Rodriguez began, keeping his voice low. An F-22 Raptor disappeared during a routine training mission over the Rocky Mountains. The pilot, Lieutenant Colonel James Chen, is one of our most experienced Raptor pilots. He was conducting advanced maneuver training when he suddenly went off radar. Sarah listened carefully, her old instincts kicking in despite herself. She found herself analyzing the information the way she used to during mission briefings, looking for patterns and possibilities that others might miss. "Have you found any wreckage?" she asked, surprised at how naturally the questions came to her. "That's where it gets complicated," Rodriguez replied, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "We've detected intermittent signals from the aircraft's emergency beacon, but they're coming from an area that should be impossible for any aircraft to reach. The signals suggest the plane is intact, but located in a canyon system that's too narrow and dangerous for any known aircraft to navigate." Sarah frowned, trying to picture the geography of the Colorado Rockies. She had flown training missions over these mountains during her service and knew how treacherous the terrain could be. There were indeed places where the canyon walls closed in so tightly that even helicopters couldn't safely operate. "What about satellite imagery?" Sarah asked, falling back into the analytical mindset that had made her such an effective pilot. "We've tried everything," Rodriguez admitted. "The canyon walls are too steep, and there's some kind of weather interference that's blocking our view. We've sent up drones, but they either lose signal or crash when they try to navigate the narrow passages." Sarah studied the maps Rodriguez showed her, recognizing several landmarks from her flying days. The area where the signals were originating was indeed one of the most challenging pieces of terrain in the entire region. She had heard stories from other pilots about aircraft that had gone down in similar areas, never to be recovered. "I still don't understand why you need me specifically," Sarah said, though she was beginning to suspect she knew the answer. Rodriguez pulled out another document, this one containing her old service record. Sarah saw her own photograph from 12 years ago, looking impossibly young in her dress uniform, along with a detailed list of her qualifications and achievements. "According to your file, you have more experience flying in extreme mountain conditions than almost any pilot currently in service," Rodriguez explained. "You also have training in search and rescue operations, and you've successfully completed emergency landings in terrain that other pilots would consider impossible." Sarah remembered those training exercises vividly. She had always been drawn to the most challenging aspects of flying, pushing herself to master situations that others avoided. Her instructors had sometimes worried that she took too many risks, but she had never lost an aircraft or failed to complete a mission. But I haven't flown a military aircraft in over a decade, Sarah protested. My certifications have long since expired and technology has advanced significantly since I was active. We're aware of that, Rodriguez acknowledged. But General Harrison believes that your natural flying ability and knowledge of this specific terrain make you uniquely qualified to help with this rescue operation. He also mentioned that you have experience with unconventional problem solving that could be crucial in this situation. Sarah couldn't help but smile slightly at that description. She had indeed earned a reputation for finding creative solutions to impossible problems. During one memorable training exercise, she had successfully landed a damaged aircraft by using a technique that violated standard operating procedures, but ultimately saved both the plane and her life. Even if I wanted to help, Sarah said, I have responsibilities here. My daughter needs me and I can't just abandon my life on short notice. Rodriguez nodded understandingly. We've considered that, ma'am. If you agree to assist us, we can arrange for Emma to stay with a trusted family friend or relative while you're away. We estimate this operation would take no more than a week, possibly less if we're successful quickly. The mention of Emma's name surprised Sarah. She realized that the military had obviously done thorough research before approaching her, probably including background checks on her current life and circumstances. The thought made her slightly uncomfortable, but she also understood the necessity from an operational security standpoint. There's something else you should know, Rodriguez continued, his expression becoming even more serious. Lieutenant Colonel Chen isn't just any pilot. He's been working on a classified project involving new F-22 capabilities. The aircraft he was flying contains technology that absolutely cannot fall into the wrong hands. Sarah felt a chill as she understood the implications. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a matter of national security. The mountains where Chen had disappeared were remote, but they weren't completely uninhabited. There were mining operations, hiking trails, and even some small communities scattered throughout the region. How long has he been missing? Sarah asked. 72 hours as of this morning, Rodriguez replied. We know he survived the initial incident because we've received brief radio transmissions, but we haven't been able to establish clear communication. The last message we received suggested that he's injured but mobile. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to imagine what Chen must be experiencing. She had been in emergency situations before, though never anything quite like this. The combination of being injured, alone, and responsible for protecting classified technology would create enormous psychological pressure for any pilot. If I were to help, Sarah said carefully, what exactly would you need me to do? Rodriguez leaned forward, clearly sensing that she was beginning to consider the possibility. We need you to guide a rescue team through the canyon system using a specially modified helicopter. Your knowledge of mountain flying and your ability to read terrain that other pilots can't navigate safely would be essential. Sarah thought about Emma, who would be coming home from school in a few hours expecting her mother to help with homework and prepare dinner. She thought about Mrs. Patterson, who depended on her to keep the library running smoothly. She thought about the quiet, predictable life she had built so carefully over the past 12 years. But she also thought about Lieutenant Colonel Chen, alone and injured somewhere in the mountains, protecting secrets that could affect national security. She thought about General Harrison, who had never asked anything of her before, reaching out now in what must be a desperate situation. I need some time to think about this, Sarah said finally. Rodriguez nodded and handed her a card with a phone number. I understand, ma'am, but I should mention that time is a critical factor. Weather reports show a major storm system moving into the area. If we don't attempt a rescue within the next 48 hours, we may not get another chance until spring. Sarah took the card, feeling its weight as if it contained much more than just a phone number. She realized that whatever decision she made in the next few hours would change everything about the life she had so carefully constructed. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table staring at Captain Rodriguez's business card while Emma worked on her math homework nearby. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal after the morning's unexpected visit. Emma was humming softly to herself as she worked through multiplication problems, completely unaware that her mother was wrestling with a decision that could upend their entire world. Mom, can you help me with this one? Emma asked, pointing to a particularly challenging word problem about calculating distances. Sarah smiled and moved closer to her daughter, explaining the problem step by step. As they worked together, she couldn't help but think about the irony. Here she was, helping Emma calculate simple distances on paper, while being asked to navigate some of the most treacherous terrain in North America to save a fellow pilot. After Emma went to bed, Sarah found herself standing in her bedroom closet, staring at a dusty cardboard box pushed far into the back corner. She hadn't opened it in years, but she knew exactly what it contained. With trembling hands, she pulled the box out and set it on her bed. Inside were the remnants of her military career, photographs of her with her squadron, commendation letters, her flight wings, and various certificates and awards. At the bottom of the box was her old flight jacket, the leather worn soft from years of use. On the sleeve was a patch with a phoenix rising from flames, her squadron insignia that had given her the call sign she was now known by once again. Sarah picked up a photograph showing her standing next to an F-16, grinning broadly with her helmet tucked under her arm. She looked so young, so confident, so ready to take on the world. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime who had lived by different rules and faced different challenges. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had become like a grandmother to Emma. The message was simple. Saw that military man at the library today. Everything okay, dear? Sarah realized that news of Captain Rodriguez's visit would spread quickly through their small town. People here looked out for each other, but they also noticed when anything unusual happened. She would need to come up with an explanation soon, regardless of what decision she made. Unable to sleep, Sarah made herself a cup of tea and stepped out onto her back porch. The night was clear, and she could see stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. During her flying days, she had spent countless hours navigating by those same stars, using them as guides when electronic systems failed or when she needed to maintain radio silence. She thought about Lieutenant Colonel Chen, somewhere out there in the mountains under that same sky. He was probably cold, possibly injured, and definitely scared, even if he would never admit it. She knew from experience that being alone in survival situations could break even the strongest people. The mind played tricks, hope faded, and despair could set in quickly. Sarah's phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. Hello? She answered cautiously. Phoenix, it's been too long. The voice was gruff but warm, unmistakably belonging to General Harrison. Even after all these years, hearing her old call sign from him sent a chill down her spine. General, Sarah replied, automatically straightening her posture even though he couldn't see her. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I imagine Captain Rodriguez filled you in on our situation, Harrison said. I want you to know that I wouldn't have suggested your name if I had any other options. This is about as bad as it gets, Sarah. Sarah had always appreciated Harrison's directness. He never sugar-coated difficult situations or tried to manipulate people with false optimism. If he said things were bad, they were genuinely desperate. Sir, I've been out of the service for 12 years, Sarah reminded him. Surely there are active pilots who could handle this better than I could. I've got some of the best pilots in the Air Force working on this problem, Harrison replied. But none of them know those mountains the way you do. Remember that training exercise we ran when you were a lieutenant? The one where you successfully navigated Devil's Canyon in weather that grounded everyone else? Sarah remembered it vividly. Devil's Canyon was considered unnavigable by aircraft, but she had studied the terrain for weeks beforehand, memorizing every rock formation and wind pattern. When a simulated emergency had required her to fly through it during a storm, she had somehow managed to thread the needle and complete the mission. That was different, Sarah protested. That was training, and I was flying a much smaller aircraft. The principles are the same, Harrison said firmly. You have an instinct for reading terrain that can't be taught. You see possibilities where other pilots see only obstacles. That's exactly what we need right now. Sarah walked back inside and looked at the photograph of herself by the F-16. She remembered the feeling of pure exhilaration that came with pushing an aircraft to its limits, the satisfaction of successfully completing missions that others thought impossible. General, I have a daughter now, Sarah said. I can't just abandon my responsibilities here. I understand that and I respect it, Harrison replied. But I need you to consider something. If we can't recover that aircraft and its pilot, there are going to be consequences that go far beyond one missing man. The technology on that plane could change the balance of power if it falls into the wrong hands. Sarah felt the weight of implication in his words. She had clearance for classified information during her service and understood how sensitive military technology could affect international relations and national security. "What exactly is on that aircraft?" she asked. Harrison paused for a long moment. "I can't discuss specifics over an unsecured line, but I can tell you that it represents several years and billions of dollars in research and development. More importantly, it could be reverse engineered by hostile forces if they get their hands on it." Sarah looked through her kitchen window at Emma's bicycle sitting in the backyard, a normal sight from a normal life. She thought about all the other children in town, all the families living their quiet lives without worrying about military technology or international security threats. Someone had to protect that normalcy, even if it meant sacrificing her own. "If I agree to help," Sarah said slowly, "I want guarantees about Emma's safety and care while I'm gone." "Absolutely," Harrison replied immediately. "We'll arrange for whatever support you need. Mrs. Chen has already volunteered to take care of Emma if necessary." Sarah was surprised that they had already spoken to her neighbor, but she realized it made sense from an operational planning perspective. The military would want to have all contingencies covered before making their formal request. "How long would I be away?" Sarah asked. "If everything goes according to plan, no more than 72 hours, Harrison said. "But I won't lie to you about the risks. The terrain is dangerous, the weather window is narrow, and we're not entirely sure what we'll find when we locate the aircraft." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine explaining to Emma why she had to leave suddenly. Her daughter had grown up without a father who was often absent due to work commitments. Sarah had promised herself that she would always be available for Emma, that their family would be stable and predictable. But she also thought about Lieutenant Colonel Chen's family, who were probably going through agony, not knowing whether their loved one was alive or dead. She thought about the other military families who might be affected if sensitive technology was compromised. "I need until morning to decide," Sarah said finally. "I understand," Harrison replied. "But Sarah, I want you to know that I believe you're the only person who can pull this off. I wouldn't ask if I thought there was any other way." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her quiet kitchen for a long time, listening to the sounds of her sleeping house and trying to decide whether to return to a world she had left behind for good reasons. Sarah woke up before dawn, having slept fitfully for only a few hours. She had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, weighing her options and trying to imagine how she would explain her decision to Emma. By the time the first light appeared outside her bedroom window, she had made up her mind. She called Captain Rodriguez at 6 in the morning, knowing that military personnel were always awake early. He answered on the first ring as if he had been waiting by the phone. "I'll do it," Sarah said simply, "but I have conditions." "Name them," Rodriguez replied without hesitation. "I want daily contact with my daughter while I'm gone. I want a full briefing on the aircraft's capabilities and the terrain we'll be dealing with. And I want to meet the rest of the team before we begin the operation." "All of that can be arranged," Rodriguez assured her. "How soon can you be ready to leave?" Sarah looked around her bedroom, thinking about everything she would need to organize in the next few hours. "I need to get Emma to school and make arrangements for her care. I can be ready by this afternoon." "Perfect. There's a car waiting outside to take you to Peterson Air Force Base whenever you're ready. We'll have all the briefing materials prepared." Sarah ended the call and immediately went to Emma's room. Her daughter was still sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that their world was about to change dramatically. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and gently shook Emma's shoulder. "Sweetie, wake up. We need to talk." Emma opened her eyes slowly, blinking in confusion at being awakened so early. "Is everything okay, Mom? You look worried." Sarah had practiced this conversation in her head several times during the night, but she still wasn't sure how to explain the situation without frightening Emma or revealing classified information. "Remember how I told you that I used to fly planes for the Air Force before you were born?" Sarah began carefully. Emma nodded, becoming more alert. Sarah had shared some general stories about her military service, though she had never gone into detail about the dangerous aspects of her former career. "Well, there's a pilot who's in trouble in the mountains and they've asked me to help rescue him. It means I'll have to go away for a few days." Emma sat up immediately, her eyes wide with concern. "You're leaving? When? For how long?" "Just for a few days, probably less than a week," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring. "Mrs. Chen has already agreed to take care of you while I'm gone. You know how much she loves having you visit? Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this information. At 10 years old, she was mature enough to understand that sometimes adults had to do difficult things, but young enough to be frightened by sudden changes to her routine. Is it dangerous? Emma asked quietly. Sarah considered lying, but she had always tried to be honest with her daughter about important matters. There is some danger involved, she admitted, but I'll be with a team of professionals and I have a lot of experience with this kind of thing. Emma threw her arms around her mother, holding on tightly. I don't want you to go. What if something happens to you? Sarah felt her heart breaking as she held her daughter close. This was exactly why she had left the military in the first place, to avoid putting Emma through the fear and uncertainty that came with dangerous missions. Nothing is going to happen to me, Sarah said firmly. I promise. And I'll call you every day to let you know I'm okay. After getting Emma ready for school and walking her to Mrs. Chen's house, Sarah returned home to pack. She wasn't sure what kind of gear she would need, so she focused on basic clothing and personal items. The military would provide any specialized equipment required for the mission. As she was closing her suitcase, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed her ex-husband Mark's number, which was unusual since he typically only called on weekends to talk to Emma. Hello, Mark, Sarah answered, wondering how he could possibly have heard about her situation. Sarah, I just got a call from General Harrison, Mark said, his voice tense with concern. He explained what's happening. Are you sure about this? Sarah wasn't surprised that Harrison had contacted Mark. As Emma's father and a commercial pilot himself, he would need to be informed about any situation that might affect their daughter's safety or well-being. I've already committed to helping, Sarah replied. Emma is going to stay with Mrs. Chen and I'll be back in a few days. That's not what I meant, Mark said. Sarah, you've been out of military flying for over a decade. This isn't like riding a bicycle. Combat aircraft and rescue operations require current training and certification. Sarah felt a flash of irritation at his condescending tone. Mark had always been competitive about their respective flying careers, and she suspected he was questioning her abilities more than expressing genuine concern. I appreciate your concern, Sarah said coolly, but this decision has already been made. General Harrison wouldn't have requested me if he didn't think I was capable of handling the mission. Mark was quiet for a moment. I know we had our differences, but I don't want anything to happen to you. Emma needs her mother. Despite their complicated history, Sarah could hear genuine worry in Mark's voice. She softened her tone slightly. I'll be careful, Mark, I promise. If you need anything at all, call me immediately, Mark said. I can be in Colorado in a few hours if necessary. After ending the call, Sarah finished packing and called for the military transport that Rodriguez had arranged. A black sedan arrived precisely on time, driven by a young airman who loaded her luggage efficiently and held the door open for her. As they drove through the familiar streets of her town, Sarah watched ordinary people going about their daily routines, a mother pushing a stroller, an elderly man walking his dog, teenagers waiting for the school bus. None of them knew that somewhere in the mountains, a crisis was unfolding that could potentially affect national security. The drive to Peterson Air Force Base took about 2 hours, giving Sarah time to mentally prepare for her return to military life. She tried to remember the protocols and procedures that had once been second nature to her. The rigid hierarchy, the precise language, the constant awareness of security procedures. When they arrived at the base, Sarah was struck by how familiar yet foreign everything seemed. The buildings, the uniforms, the sound of aircraft engines in the distance all brought back powerful memories. But she also felt like an outsider now, a civilian visiting a world she had once belonged to completely. Captain Rodriguez met her at the security checkpoint and escorted her through the base to a secure briefing room. The space was windowless and stark, with maps covering one wall and computer screens displaying weather data and satellite imagery. Major Mitchell, a voice called out as she entered the room. Sarah turned to see a woman in flight gear approaching her with an extended hand. I'm Colonel Jennifer Park, Mission Commander. General Harrison has told me a lot about you. Sarah shook the colonel's hand, automatically returning to the formal posture and manner she had once used daily. Thank you for including me in this operation, Colonel. Let's get you briefed on what we're dealing with, Colonel Park said, leading Sarah to a table covered with detailed topographical maps. Because frankly, we need all the help we can get. Colonel Park spread a detailed topographical map across the briefing table, marking it with red pins to show the last known position of Lieutenant Colonel Chen's aircraft. Sarah studied the terrain carefully, noting the elevation changes, canyon systems, and weather patterns that could affect any rescue operation. The F-22 was conducting advanced maneuver testing when something went wrong, Colonel Park explained. Chen radioed that he was experiencing control problems and attempting an emergency landing. That was the last clear communication we received. Sarah traced her finger along the flight path marked on the map, recognizing several landmarks from her own training flights years earlier. The area where Chen had disappeared was known as the Devil's Backbone, a series of interconnected canyons that formed natural wind tunnels and created extremely dangerous flying conditions. What kind of control problems? Sarah asked, falling back into the analytical mindset that had made her an effective pilot. Preliminary data suggests a possible hydraulic failure, replied Major Thompson, the team's technical specialist. The F-22's fly-by-wire system should have compensated, but there may have been multiple system failures. Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. Without hydraulic controls, even the most skilled pilot would have difficulty managing an aircraft as complex as the F-22. Chen would have been fighting just to keep the plane in the air long enough to find a suitable landing site. Show me the emergency beacon data, Sarah requested, moving to examine the computer screens displaying signal information. This is where it gets strange, Major Thompson said, pulling up a series of electronic readings. We're receiving intermittent signals from the aircraft's emergency transponder, but the location data doesn't make sense. According to the readings, the aircraft is intact and positioned in a canyon that should be too narrow for any fixed-wing aircraft to enter. Sarah studied the data carefully, comparing it to the topographical information. She remembered flying over this area during training exercises and being struck by how dramatically the landscape changed within just a few miles. There were indeed places where the canyon walls closed in so tightly that even helicopters had trouble maneuvering. What about weather conditions? Sarah asked, knowing that mountain weather could change rapidly and dramatically affect any rescue attempt. Colonel Park pulled up a meteorological report showing current and projected conditions. We have a narrow window of opportunity. There's a major storm system moving in from the west that will make flying impossible for at least a week. If we don't attempt the rescue within the next 36 hours, Chen will be on his own until the weather clears. Sarah felt the familiar pressure of time-critical decision-making. During her active service, she had learned to function effectively under extreme time constraints. But the stakes had never involved someone's life hanging in the balance for such an extended period. Tell me about the aircraft's capabilities, Sarah said, turning to the classified technical data she had been cleared to review. Major Thompson pulled out a series of documents marked with the highest security classifications. The F-22 Chen was flying contained several experimental systems that are not yet in general service. Advanced radar countermeasures, new weapon systems, and flight control technology that represents years of research and development. Sarah reviewed the technical specifications, trying to understand both the aircraft's vulnerabilities and its potential for survival in a crash scenario. The F-22 was built to withstand significant damage, but a hard landing in rocky terrain could cause unpredictable structural failures. Have you been able to establish any communication with Lieutenant Colonel Chen? Sarah asked. Brief transmissions only, Colonel Park replied. We've received 3 short radio messages indicating that he's alive and mobile, but injured. The canyon walls are interfering with signal transmission, so we can't maintain sustained contact. Sarah understood the psychological pressure Chen must be experiencing. Being injured and alone in hostile terrain was challenging enough for any pilot. But knowing that he was responsible for protecting classified technology would add enormous stress to an already difficult situation. What's the plan for getting into the canyon? Sarah asked, studying the maps again to identify possible approach routes. Colonel Park indicated a modified rescue helicopter equipped with specialized navigation equipment. We've arranged for a Black Hawk with enhanced GPS and terrain-following radar. The plan is to use your knowledge of the canyon systems to guide the aircraft through passages that are too narrow or dangerous for normal navigation. Sarah walked over to examine the helicopter, noting the modifications that had been made for mountain rescue operations. Extra fuel tanks, advanced communication equipment, and specialized medical gear filled the cargo area. The aircraft was designed for exactly this type of mission. but success would depend entirely on the pilot's ability to navigate terrain that pushed the limits of what was considered possible. "Who's flying?" Sarah asked, knowing that the pilot's skill level would be crucial to mission success. "Chief Warrant Officer Maria Santos," Colonel Park replied. "She has more mountain rescue experience than anyone currently in service, including several successful operations in terrain similar to what we'll be facing." Sarah was introduced to Santos, a compact woman in her mid-30s with the calm confidence that marked experienced helicopter pilots. They spent an hour discussing flight procedures, emergency protocols, and contingency plans for various scenarios they might encounter. "I've studied the terrain maps, but I've never actually flown in those specific canyons," Santos admitted. "Your experience with the area could make the difference between success and failure." Sarah appreciated Santos's honesty about the challenges they would face. Too many pilots let ego interfere with their judgment, refusing to acknowledge limitations that could prove fatal in dangerous situations. As the briefing continued, Sarah found herself slipping back into the mental state that had made her an effective military pilot. The careful analysis of risks and options, the precise planning for multiple contingencies, the acceptance that dangerous missions required absolute focus and commitment. But she also kept thinking about Emma, who was probably finishing her school day and wondering when her mother would call. Sarah had promised daily contact, and she intended to keep that promise regardless of how the mission developed. "When do we launch?" Sarah asked, looking at the weather data one more time. "First light tomorrow," Colonel Park replied. "Weather conditions will be optimal for about 6 hours, giving us enough time to locate Chen and extract him before the storm hits." Sarah nodded, understanding that they would have only one chance to succeed. If they failed to locate Chen during the weather window, he would be stranded in the mountains for at least another week, possibly longer if additional storms developed. "I need to call my daughter," Sarah said, checking her watch and realizing that Emma would be home from school soon. "Absolutely," Colonel Park replied. "Use the secure phone in the communications room. And Major Mitchell," she added as Sarah turned to leave, "thank you for doing this. I know it wasn't an easy decision." Sarah made her way to the communications room, thinking about how to explain to Emma that the mission would begin tomorrow without causing unnecessary worry. She also needed to call Mrs. Chen to confirm the care arrangements and make sure Emma would have everything she needed while her mother was away. As she dialed Emma's number, Sarah realized that within 24 hours, she would be flying into some of the most dangerous terrain in North America, attempting a rescue that experienced military pilots considered nearly impossible. The quiet life she had built over the past 12 years suddenly seemed very far away. Sarah woke at 4:30 in the morning, her body automatically adjusting to the military schedule she hadn't followed in over a decade. The base guest quarters were Spartan but comfortable, reminding her of countless similar rooms she had occupied during her active service. Outside her window, she could see aircraft silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, their engines warming up for early morning missions. After a quick shower and a light breakfast, Sarah joined the rescue team in the mission briefing room. The weather report showed optimal conditions for the next 6 hours, with clear skies and minimal wind. However, the approaching storm system was moving faster than originally predicted, which meant they would have even less time than planned. Latest satellite imagery shows no change in the beacon signals, Major Thompson reported. Chen is still in the same general location, and we received another brief radio transmission 3 hours ago confirming that he's alive. Sarah studied the updated topographical data, noting how the morning sun would affect visibility and wind patterns in the canyon system. She had learned during her flying career that successful missions depended as much on understanding environmental factors as on pilot skill and aircraft capability. Chief, Warrant Officer Santos approached with a flight, helmet and communication headset. "Ready to see if we can thread the needle?" she asked with a grin that didn't quite hide her nervousness about the challenging mission ahead. Sarah accepted the gear and performed the familiar routine of adjusting the helmet and checking the communication systems. The equipment was more advanced than what she had used during her active service, but the basic functions remained the same. Within minutes, she felt comfortable with the setup. The modified Black Hawk was waiting on the flight line, its rotors already spinning slowly as the crew completed final pre-flight checks. Sarah climbed aboard and strapped herself into the observer's seat, noting the sophisticated navigation equipment and rescue gear that filled the aircraft's cabin. As they lifted off, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of leaving the ground behind and entering the three-dimensional world of flight. The base fell away below them, replaced by the rolling landscape of eastern Colorado. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains rose like a wall of stone and snow, hiding the canyons where Lieutenant Colonel Chen was waiting for rescue. Flight time to the target area is approximately 45 minutes, Santos reported through the intercom. Weather conditions are holding steady, but we'll need to work fast once we reach the canyon system. Sarah watched the terrain change as they flew westward, transitioning from plains to foothills to the Sirius Mountains where the rescue would take place. She recognized several landmarks from her training flights, though seeing them from a helicopter rather than a fighter aircraft gave her a different perspective on the challenges they would face. I'm picking up the emergency beacon. Signal, the aircraft's electronics specialist reported. Signal strength is increasing as we approach the target coordinates. Sarah studied the canyon system through binoculars, looking for visual clues that might help them locate Chen's aircraft. The early morning light created sharp shadows that could either reveal or conceal wreckage, depending on the angle of observation. There, Sarah said suddenly, pointing to a narrow canyon that branched off from the main system. I can see metal reflecting sunlight about 2 miles up that canyon. Santos maneuvered the helicopter for a better view, carefully maintaining altitude to avoid the dangerous wind currents that formed between the canyon walls. Through the aircraft's powerful cameras, they could see the distinctive shape of an F-22 Raptor, wedged between rock formations in what appeared to be an impossible landing site. How did he get in there? Santos wondered aloud, studying the narrow canyon opening that seemed far too small for a fighter aircraft. Sarah examined the terrain carefully, trying to reconstruct Chen's approach path. He must have come in from the northwest using that valley system as a funnel. It would have required perfect timing and incredible skill to thread that gap. And now we have to figure out how to get in there to extract him, Santos said grimly. The canyon walls are less than 50 feet apart in some places. Sarah continued studying the wreckage through binoculars, looking for signs of movement that would indicate Chen's current position. The aircraft appeared to be intact except for damage to the landing gear and possibly the wings, which suggested that Chen had managed a controlled crash landing despite his aircraft's mechanical problems. I see movement near the aircraft, Sarah reported. Someone is waving from behind the wreckage. Santos carefully maneuvered the helicopter closer to the canyon entrance, testing the wind currents and evaluating their options for entering the narrow passage. The rotor wash from their aircraft was creating dust clouds that reduced visibility, making the approach even more challenging. This is going to be tight, Santos muttered, studying the gap between the canyon walls. I'm not sure we can maintain rotor clearance if the wind shifts. Sarah remembered flying through similar terrain during training exercises, though never in a helicopter, and never with someone's life depending on her navigation skills. She studied the rock formations carefully, looking for the subtle wind patterns and air currents that could either help or hinder their approach. Try approaching from the southeast, Sarah suggested. The wind should be more stable from that direction. And there's a slightly wider gap about a quarter mile up the canyon. Santos nodded and adjusted their approach, flying a careful pattern that kept them clear of the most dangerous turbulence while allowing them to evaluate the canyon entrance. The helicopter's engines echoed off the rock walls, creating a thunderous noise that made communication difficult. As they entered the canyon system, Sarah felt her heart rate increase with the familiar combination of excitement and fear that accompanied dangerous flying. The canyon walls rose around them like stone skyscrapers, creating a claustrophobic environment where a single mistake could be fatal. Rotor clearance is less than 20 feet on each side, Santos reported, her voice tense with concentration. We're committed now. Sarah watched the rock walls slip past just outside the helicopter's windows, close enough to touch if the glass had been open. She called out navigation instructions based on her analysis of the terrain, guiding Santos through the safest path toward Chen's location. Visual contact with the pilot, the crew chief reported. He's approximately 200 yards ahead near the aircraft wreckage. Through the helicopter's cameras, they could see Chen clearly now. He was standing near his aircraft, waving both arms to signal their position. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that he was favoring one leg and moving stiffly, indicating injuries that would complicate the extraction. There's a small clearing about 50 yards from the aircraft, Sarah observed, studying the terrain ahead. It might be large enough for a hover extraction if we can manage the wind currents. Santos evaluated the proposed landing zone, noting the rocky terrain and the swirling air currents created by the canyon walls. It's going to be challenging, but it's our best option. We'll have to work fast, though. I can't maintain a stable hover in these conditions for very long. As they approached Chen's position, Sarah could see the damage to his F-22 more clearly. The aircraft had slid several hundred feet after landing, coming to rest against a rock formation that had prevented it from tumbling into the deeper parts of the canyon. Chen had been incredibly lucky to survive the crash, but extracting him from this location would require all their skill and not a small amount of luck. Preparing for hover extraction, Santos announced. Everyone ready? Sarah checked her safety harness and prepared for what she knew would be the most challenging part of their mission. Getting into the canyon had been difficult, but getting out safely with an injured pilot would test every aspect of their training and experience. Santos brought the Blackhawk into a careful hover about 30 feet above the narrow canyon floor, fighting the swirling wind currents that threatened to slam them into the rock walls. The helicopter's rotor wash kicked up dust and debris, creating a brown cloud that reduced visibility to just a few yards in any direction. Deploying rescue basket, the crew chief announced, lowering the extraction device on a steel cable toward Chen's position. Sarah watched through the aircraft's camera system as the injured pilot limped toward the basket, clearly struggling with what appeared to be a leg injury and possibly broken ribs. He's having trouble getting into the basket, Sarah observed, noting how Chen was favoring his left side and moving with obvious pain. His injuries are more serious than we thought. The helicopter shuddered as a sudden gust of wind pushed them sideways toward the canyon wall. Santos fought the controls expertly, using every bit of her experience to maintain position while the crew chief worked to guide Chen into the rescue basket. Got him, the crew chief reported. Bringing him up now. Sarah watched as Chen was slowly lifted from the canyon floor, spinning slightly on the cable as the wind currents caught the basket. The pilot's face was pale but determined, and he gave a thumbs-up signal to indicate that he was secure and ready for extraction. Just as the basket reached the helicopter's cargo door, a powerful downdraft slammed into them, dropping the aircraft suddenly toward the canyon floor. Santos pulled maximum power and managed to arrest their descent, but not before the helicopter's landing gear scraped against a rock outcropping with a grinding sound that made everyone aboard wince. Are we damaged? Sarah asked, noting warning lights flashing on the aircraft's instrument panel. Minor structural damage to the landing gear, Santos replied through gritted teeth. We can still fly, but we need to get out of this canyon before something else goes wrong. The crew chief hauled Chen aboard and immediately began checking his injuries. The pilot was conscious and alert, though clearly in significant pain. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and there were cuts and bruises covering his face and arms. Lieutenant Colonel Chen, I'm Sergeant Martinez, the crew chief said, beginning emergency medical treatment. We're going to get you to a hospital, but first we need to secure you for flight. Chen nodded weakly, then looked around the helicopter's cabin until his eyes focused on Sarah. You're Phoenix, he said with surprise, recognizing her call sign despite never having met her personally. I heard General Harrison was bringing in the legend herself. Sarah felt a mixture of embarrassment and pride at being recognized by a fellow pilot. Just focus on staying conscious, she replied. We'll have you out of here soon. Santos began the delicate process of flying back through the canyon system, retracing their route while dealing with increased wind turbulence and the helicopter's damaged landing gear. The aircraft handled differently now, requiring constant adjustments to maintain stable flight. Weather is deteriorating faster than predicted, the electronics specialist reported. We've got heavy clouds moving in from the west and wind speeds are increasing. Sarah looked out the helicopter's windows and could see dark storm clouds building on the horizon. The clear morning conditions that had made their mission possible were rapidly disappearing, replaced by the kind of mountain weather that grounded even the most experienced pilots. Can we make it back to base before the storm hits? Sarah asked, studying the approaching weather system. It's going to be close, Santos replied, pushing the helicopter to maximum safe speed while navigating through the canyon walls. We might have to find an alternate landing site if conditions deteriorate too quickly. As they emerged from the canyon system into more open terrain, Sarah felt a sense of relief that surprised her with its intensity. The mission had been successful, but the combination of dangerous flying conditions and the responsibility for Chen's life had created stress levels she hadn't experienced since her active military service. Emergency services are standing by at Peterson Air Force Base. Colonel Park's voice crackled through the radio. Medical team is prepared for immediate treatment upon your arrival. Chen had remained conscious throughout the extraction, though his condition was clearly serious. Sergeant Martinez had managed to stabilize his leg injury and stop the bleeding from various cuts, but he would need surgery to repair the damage from his crash landing. The F-22, Chen said weakly, grabbing Sarah's arm. The classified systems. They can't fall into the wrong hands. Sarah nodded, understanding his concern. Recovery teams are already being organized. As soon as the weather clears, they'll secure the aircraft and extract the sensitive equipment. Chen relaxed slightly, knowing that his primary responsibility as a pilot, carrying classified technology, had been addressed. The physical injuries could be treated, but compromising national security would have had consequences that extended far beyond any individual mission. As they approached Peterson Air Force Base, Sarah could see emergency vehicles positioned on the runway, ready to transport Chen to the base hospital. The storm clouds were building rapidly now, with the first raindrops beginning to spatter against the helicopter's windscreen. Landing in 2 minutes, Santos announced, bringing the damaged Black Hawk in for what turned out to be a surprisingly smooth touchdown despite the structural damage they had sustained in the canyon. Medical personnel swarmed the aircraft as soon as the rotors stopped spinning, carefully extracting Chen and loading him onto a stretcher for immediate transport to the hospital. He remained conscious and alert, giving Sarah a final salute as he was wheeled away. Colonel Park approached as Sarah climbed down from the helicopter, a broad smile on her face despite the exhaustion that marked everyone involved in the mission. Outstanding work, the colonel said, shaking Sarah's hand firmly. That extraction should have been impossible according to conventional flying wisdom. Chen owes his life to your navigation skills. Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction that she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. The combination of technical challenge, life or death stakes, and successful teamwork had reminded her why she had chosen to become a pilot in the first place. But as the adrenaline began to fade, Sarah's thoughts immediately turned to Emma, who was probably finishing her school day and wondering when her mother would call. The mission had been successful, but Sarah was eager to return to her normal life and reassure her daughter that everything was okay. "When can I go home?" Sarah asked, already thinking about the quiet evening routine she would share with Emma, helping with homework and preparing dinner in their peaceful kitchen. "Transport is being arranged now," Colonel Park replied. "You should be back home by evening. And Major Mitchell," she added, "if you ever consider returning to active duty, the Air Force would be honored to have you back." Sarah smiled but shook her head. "Thank you, but my flying days are behind me. I have a daughter who needs her mother to stay safely on the ground." As she waited for her transportation home, Sarah watched other aircraft taking off and landing at the busy airbase. She felt proud of what they had accomplished, but she also felt ready to return to her role as a librarian and single mother. Some chapters of life were meant to be closed, even when they ended with successful missions and grateful colleagues. The storm finally arrived just as Sarah's transport pulled away from the base, bringing the kind of weather that would have made their rescue mission impossible. They had succeeded with less than an hour to spare, and Lieutenant Colonel Chen was alive because of teamwork, skill, and perhaps a small amount of luck. 3 hours later, Sarah walked through her front door to find Emma and Mrs. Chen making cookies in the kitchen, the house filled with the warm smells of home and the sound of her daughter's laughter. After 12 years away from military life, Phoenix had successfully completed one final mission, but Sarah Mitchell was exactly where she belonged.